My name is Dorothy Callum, and I am 64 years old, and I worked for 31 years. As a medical transcriptionist, which means I spent 3 decades listening to things other people said and writing them down with absolute precision, and I want you to understand that skill before I tell you what I did. With it, because precision is not something you switch off when you leave. The office it becomes the way you move through the world, the way you notice things other people let slide, the way you remember exactly what was said and when and by whom, and I did not expect that skill to become the thing that saved me, but that is exactly what it became. And it started the way these things always start, not with a dramatic moment, but with a small a Tuesday evening phone call from my son Christopher 3 months after my husband Leonard passed away. Christopher called to check in. He said, and we talked for 20 minutes, and it was only afterward, sitting in the quiet of the house, that I replayed the conversation in my head the way I had replayed recordings for 30 years. And I noticed something that had been there the whole time underneath the "How are you doing, Mom?" And the "Are you eating enough, Mom?" there had been questions that were not really questions. Are you finding the finances manageable? And do you feel like the house is becoming too much? And have you thought about what comes next? And they were gentle and they were caring on the surface. And underneath them was a current I recognized, because I had spent 31 years learning to hear what was underneath things. And I sat in Leonard's chair by the window, and I thought about that current for a long time. And Christopher was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that. He was. My son and I had raised him, and I knew him and what I heard in those questions was not malice. It was something more complicated than malice. It was the sound of a man who had already been having conversations about me that did not include me, and I knew that because I knew my son, and I knew the particular shape his sentences made when he was relaying, thinking that had been done elsewhere. And 3 weeks later I understood more clearly when Christopher arrived at my house on a Saturday morning with his wife Nadine, and they sat across from me at my own kitchen table with the careful posture of people who have rehearsed what they are about to say. And Christopher said, "Mom, we have been thinking." And Nadine sat with her hands folded, and Christopher said, "We are worried about you here alone in this house." And I said, "I am fine, Christopher." And he said, "Mom, we really think it might be time to consider your options." And that word, options, landed on the kitchen table between us like something that had been dropped. And I looked at my son, and I looked at Nadine, and I said, "What options?" And Christopher said, "There are some really lovely places that specialize in." And I said, "Christopher, I am 64 years old, and I transcribed medical documents last Tuesday, and I am not going anywhere." And he looked at Nadine, and Nadine looked at her folded hands, and they left 40 minutes later, and I sat at my kitchen table alone, and I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator where I kept batteries and rubber bands, and an old grocery list in Leonard's handwriting, and I took out the small digital recorder I had used for years to capture dictation when my computer was slow, and I held it in my hand for a moment, and I made a decision, and the recording began. And for the next 11 months I recorded everything, every phone call from Christopher, every visit, every conversation where he asked gentle, careful questions about whether I was managing the house and whether I had looked into anything yet, and whether I had spoken to anyone about my situation. And I kept a notebook, 2 dates and times and exact words, the way I had kept notes for 31 years, and I was methodical about it, because methodical was the only way I knew how to be, and 4 months in Christopher stopped asking questions and started making statements. He told my sister Helen that I had been confused lately. He told my neighbor Frank that he was worried I was not coping, and Frank mentioned it to me over the fence one afternoon in March, with a careful tone of someone delivering news they are not
sure they should be delivering. And I thanked Frank, and I went inside and I wrote it down, and I called my attorney, a woman named Susan who had handled Leonard's estate, and I sat in her office and I told her everything. And when I finished, she looked at me for a moment and said, "Dorothy, how long have you been recording?" And I said, 11 months. And she said, "Good."
And I felt something settle in my chest, the way things settle when someone with authority looks at what you have been doing alone and tells you it was the right thing. And 7 months in, Christopher filed a petition for guardianship. And I want you to understand what that means, because I had transcribed enough medical and legal documents to understand it. Precisely, it meant my son had gone to a courthouse and filed papers, asking a judge to determine that I was not capable of managing my own life and my own affairs, and I sat with that knowledge for an evening in Leonard's chair by the window, and I was not angry the way people expect you to be. Angry, I was something quieter than angry. I was certain, and the certainty was this: I had been right to start recording, and the morning of the hearing I wore the blue dress I had worn to Leonard's retirement dinner, and I drove myself to the courthouse, and I parked my own car, and I walked in with Susan beside me, and Christopher was already there with his attorney, a man named Gerald, who was polished and well prepared, and confident in the way people are confident when they believe they have already won. And Christopher did not look at me when I came in, and Gerald called 2 witnesses, a former colleague of Christopher's, who said he had concerns about my well-being based on things Christopher had told him, which meant he had no direct knowledge, only second-hand worry. And a doctor I had seen once for a routine physical, who had noted in my chart that I mentioned feeling lonely after my husband's death, which is a true thing I had said, and also a true thing that has nothing to do with my ability to manage my own finances. And then Christopher took the stand, and he spoke about me with such tenderness that I almost did not recognize the portrait he was painting: a confused woman, a grieving woman, a woman who needed protecting. And the tenderness was real. I want to be clear about that. The love was real, and the conclusion he had drawn from the love was completely wrong. And then Susan stood up, and she said, "Your Honor, I would like to submit documentation that has not yet been presented to this court." And she placed 11 months of transcribed recordings on the table, organized by date and cross, referenced with specific claims made in the petition. And she placed my notebook, and she placed 11 months of my bank statements showing every account managed correctly, every bill paid on time, every decision made with precision. And the courtroom went very quiet, and I watched Gerald's face and I watched Christopher's face. And they were different kinds of quiet. Christopher's face was the face of someone who has just understood something that changes the shape of everything. And Gerald asked for a recess, and the judge said no, and the petition was dismissed, and the judge noted on the record that the documentation presented by the respondent demonstrated a clear and consistent pattern of competent self-management, and that the testimony offered in support of the petition relied heavily on second-hand account. And Subjective interpretation, and I sat in that courtroom, and I heard those words, and I thought about 31 years of listening carefully and writing things down, and I thought about the Tuesday evening when I first heard the current underneath my son's questions, and I thought about the drawer beside the refrigerator and the small recorder, and I thought, precision is never wasted, it always finds its moment. And Christopher called me that evening, and his voice had changed the way voices change. When someone has stopped performing and started feeling, and he said, Mom, I thought I was doing the right thing, and I said, I know, Christopher, and I believe you. And he said, I should have talked to you, and I said, yes, you should have, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I'm sorry, Mom, and I said, I know. And I believed him, because my son had never been dishonest with me. He had simply been so convinced by his own worry that he had stopped asking me what I thought and started deciding for me, and there is a difference between those two things that matters enormously. And Nadine called 3 days later, and she said, what you did was hurtful. And I said, Nadine, I understand that, and I want you to understand that. Filing legal papers to take someone's life out of their own hands without ever asking them what they want is also hurtful, and she was quiet. And I said we can talk about this honestly, or we can leave it here, and she said I need some time, and I said take what you need, and she called back a week later, and she asked questions for the first time, real ones with room for real answers, and it was not a resolution, but it was a beginning, and I have learned to value beginnings. Christopher comes by on Sundays now, and sometimes he sits in Leonard's chair, and sometimes I sit in it. And we talk about things that matter, and I went back to transcription, worked 2 days a week, because I like the precision of it, and it turns out there are practices that need experienced transcriptionists, and experience does not expire the way some people seem to think it does, and one evening, last month, I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator, and I looked at the small recorder, and I thought about 11 months of careful listening, and I put it back in the drawer, because you do not throw away the thing that told the truth for you, and if someone is making decisions about your life without asking you what you want, I want you to hear this. Your clarity is not confusion, your steadiness is not decline. And the most important thing you can do is write it down, write all of it down, because precision is never wasted, and it always finds its moment.